Quinn Underwood is the CEO of Autumn, a privacy-first startup that leverages artificial intelligence to help individuals and organizations identify early signs of burnout, depression, and other mental health challenges, and respond proactively. Autumn works with major nonprofits and scaling companies to promote mental health and prevent burnout. Quinn is also the former co-founder of Advine, a health tech company which he helped scale across Bangladesh and India. Please, let's welcome Quinn to Impact Leaders Connect 3.0.
Years knowing Samuel, this is very cool to see, and happy to share the experiences I've had and whatever learnings I've had that might be useful or interesting. So I'll share my screen in a second, but at a high level, what I wanted to do was share just my own story and some of the experiences I've had. And I think what has stood out for me in my experience with particularly the use of AI and the kind of search for having a social impact is that it often was a kind of serendipitous route towards finding that AI was really the right tool for the job. And if I could share anything at all, it would be that I think AI is a tool and it is always best used in service of a very specific job to be done, rather than being seen as something that should be used just for the sake of using it. And I at a very high level, I think that's one of the key learnings that I've taken away and hopefully will be obvious over the things that, I'm able to share in my experience using AI. So first, I'll start with a little bit of my background here. Here we go. So very quickly, my background. So I'm the co-founder of several companies. I've had experience working now with a couple. The first is Advine, to which Samuel mentioned. We worked primarily in Bangladesh and East India, and we worked on providing primary healthcare to hard-to-reach communities around the world. And the primary challenge was, for many of those communities, there weren't well-trained or even any healthcare providers to provide primary health services. And so what we were really interested in doing was if we could leverage the physicians and health professionals that were located in urban cities and via telehealth, connect them with rural communities through a device that we would put on site in those communities. And for us, the kind of role that AI played was in helping us more quickly and easily identify what sort of challenges a patient might be facing before connecting them with a physician, so that when the physician did connect, they already had a kind of sense of, okay, based on this initial analysis through the technology platform, we have a sense of where the health challenge might be. And so they were able to work with many more patients across many different rural regions from the convenience of their home office or their urban office. And so we were able to provide higher quality kind of diagnostics and care at a much lower cost to many more people than if we had health practitioners in each of those places. So that was the first kind of major adventure I had in the context of using AI, particularly around a social impact goal, in this case, health. And the second for me is Autumn, and you can see here, it's one of the companies that I'm probably working closest on now. I'm one of the co-founders for, and we use AI to make kind of diagnostics around mental health and help people get resources proactively. And the whole thesis is what you can measure, you can manage. And for mental health, it's historically been incredibly difficult to actually measure or meaningfully identify signs of poor mental health. And our goal is to help equip people with the tools to do that earlier. So those are some of the projects I'm working on, and I'm going to pull from, I think, everything I've done so far in reference to this presentation. But the way that I got into all of this was really first with research I was doing in Myanmar. And I'll share this as an example of, I think, the first time that I saw the power of artificial intelligence in the context of social impact. And it was actually largely social impact in a somewhat negative way. So I was looking at mobile health technologies in Myanmar. We were looking at how we could use the proliferation of smartphones to support healthcare networks there, where many people didn't have access to health education services, didn't have access to primary care physicians or even nurse practitioners. And so we were interested in, providing access to the sort of health education just via smartphone that would help them, cover some of the basics. And so while we were there, we began hearing signs of issues of fake news. And at the time, Facebook was everywhere. Facebook was the internet for, as far as many of the citizens there were concerned, because Facebook provided their services for free. And so people didn't have to pay for data. And it was interesting because slowly over the course of my research there, we heard more and more this kind of growing worry amongst nonprofits, amongst government officials about this major issue around misinformation. And this was at a time when this wasn't a global topic. This wasn't widely discussed, and we hadn't seen so much of it as a topic come up in the United States or elsewhere. And it was interesting because oftentimes what was cited was the power of kind of Facebook's sharing structure and the algorithms that it had to put misinformation that was very viral in nature in front of people. And just after we left doing our research there, we found that, what happened was essentially you had, the army coming in and taking advantage or subjecting a particular population in Myanmar to violence, to all sorts of horrors, and ultimately with much of the backing of the population there. And so much of that was possible because the government had a fierce control on misinformation around the country and was able to build popular support, even though what they were doing was truly horrific. And so I share this just because I think that it's important that we think about AI as agnostic. It's neither good or bad. It is a tool, and it's how we use it that lends its power and really gives us the impact that either we want to or we don't. And so that for me was the kind of first experience with just how powerful some of these technologies could be, and the responsibility to think really critically about what are the risks involved, because ultimately what AI lets you do is have an impact at scale. And so that scale, for something poor can be truly detrimental. But anyways, that was the kind of first experience, and those are the things that for me really shaped kind of my interest in using AI for social impact. So I think the first question that might be useful is just to try and answer really what artificial intelligence is. And the simplest answer that I've come across is AI is a prediction machine. And essentially, the benefit of AI is in facilitating or helping you make predictions based on information that you have. And often that's going to be the form of large data sets. But I think that in common discussion about what AI is, it's often talked about or seen as a kind of cure-all or a magic kind of solution. But really where AI is most useful are in scenarios where prediction is what drives value. So an example of that for us, for admin, we were really interested in using AI to understand, could we begin to predict what health problems we would see across the populations that we were serving, based on time of year, based on the nature of the health problems that we were seeing, previously. And for us, that was really important because things like supply chains, things like getting medicine to remote communities, getting the right medicines at the right time, those things were really important. And if we had even just, a couple weeks advance notice, or we were able to make a slightly better guess about the challenges or the health problems that we would be seeing in the near future, that was incredibly valuable to us. Another example with Advent was in predicting, the kind of course of a disease. So if we had a sense of the symptoms that someone was experiencing, and we had a sense of, what common health challenges were present in the area, we could make predictions about, what we thought would happen next in the course of their symptoms, whether or not they needed to see a specialist or whether they needed to see a just a kind of telehealth physician. And so I offer this because I think that it's useful as a starting place when asking yourself if AI has a role in maybe some of the impact work that you're doing, in first kind of starting with what are the predictions that you make, and what are the predictions that you make every day. What the weather is going to be like tomorrow, right? That's a classic example of where there's this very large data sets, and we use AI in all sorts of manners to predict the weather or weather events, whether it's natural disasters or otherwise. And that ended up being relevant too in the context of Advent, where ultimately what we found was so many of the health challenges that we were serving, so many of the health challenges that we were supporting people through were actually mental health challenges. And they came kind of in the post-natural disaster scenarios where people would be suffering from PTSD or shock. And ultimately, that's what led me into the work I'm doing now with Autumn, with a focus on mental health, and the use of AI to facilitate that prediction or identify early warning signs of poor mental health and get people the care they need. So I offer this as just kind of a general definition that might be useful in thinking about what AI is and where it can be valuable. The next concept that I want to highlight, and this is relevant to that kind of point around risk, is I think that the best scenarios for AI are those in which there is a human in the loop. And this is to say that, AI on its own is powerful. As humans, we can do, incredible things, but together the opportunity is just tremendous, because when the AI is in a position where it might not have the answer, or it might make a poor prediction, you can have a person ready to take that data, interpret it, and help the AI make the right decision. And that decision making actually teaches the AI and gives them another input that allows them to refine its prediction in the future. And so you have this kind of this loop of positive feedback where the artificial intelligence is improving over time. An example of this is with the work that we do now with Autumn. So Autumn uses AI to measure psychological health, to measure early signs of poor mental health, but the power of AI is still somewhat limited in this sense. And so it's not possible to just outright diagnose how someone is feeling or doing just based on the data that we have available, primarily language data, or text data, and whatever other data a user has connected to Autumn. And so we want the people that we are working with to tell us and to tell our AI if it's accurate or not. And so they actually will tell the tool, this prediction you made about the other day, where the prediction was I was very stressed or at risk of burnout, they'll actually be able to say that wasn't accurate. I was actually feeling fine. And that human in the loop, that human involvement, means that now the AI can amend its prediction so that in the future, it maybe doesn't make that same mistake. And I think this is really important because you see a lot of examples of AI, particularly in the news, where the AI will be making non-falsifiable predictions, where it's really difficult to figure out or to be able to measure or analyze whether or not the predictions were actually accurate. An example of that for Autumn is you get a lot of AI in similar companies where they'll make predictions at a population level and say 23% of this population is experiencing depression or poor mental health. but it's really, really difficult to then go into that population and actually measure or assess how accurate that prediction was, or whether it's really just kind of reciting or spitting out kind of basic population level stats that we know about from previous research. And so having a human in the loop means that you have kind of real accountability to the accuracy of the AI. And I think that's something that we really want to highlight and enforce moving forward, as we think about how AI can be used, is always keeping a human in the loop. Social impact. So at a high level, I think like AI is a tremendous tool, and it's very wide ranging in the application that it can have. So this is from a report that McKinsey did on the variety of areas where AI was identified as having a really meaningful potential impact in the context of generating social benefit or social good. And I include this because I think what's exciting is it is so widespread. But I think it's really interesting too, because with this, the limitations of AI also become really, really obvious really quickly. And first and foremost, it's access to data. If you don't have a large database of clean data, and by clean data, I mean well organized without kind of missing information, I think like an electronic medical record or wherever you might have your medical record stored. Without a large amount of information or data for AI to be trained on, it is very difficult to develop any sort of AI system that is meaningfully accurate. And one of the biggest challenges, I think, in the context of social impact is that we're often doing kind of last mile delivery of services. We're often, working in contexts where there's a lot of instability or there isn't that kind of clarity and clean data in order for us to maybe apply AI in a way that would be most useful. And so I think that, again, as you think about where there might be opportunities in the work that you're doing, thinking really closely about what information do we already have and how can we get data or information that is clean, that doesn't have a lot of noise or missing pieces to it. And those are the places, those are the opportunities where AI could really transformatively shape how your work is done. And I think that just looking here, it's wide ranging and sometimes in places that we wouldn't even expect. And so my prediction is that just like the advent of early technologies, even like the internet, we are going to see AI, one, become much more accessible to people, where you don't have to be a data scientist, you don't have to be a computer scientist to use AI. In fact, there are already companies now that offer basically like tools that you can access just through your web browser, and you can train an AI or an AI model for yourself on data that you have. An example out there is one that lets you make predictions based on language data. So I don't know if anyone has heard of like GPT-3, but it's a massive AI model that Google developed that if you give it a writing prompt, like write a pamphlet on how to wash your hands, it will generate the text for that based on just that prompt. And in some cases, it can be so accurate that it is impossible to discern whether or not that was written by a human or whether it was generated through the AI system. And so what I think is a starting place, particularly for those of us that don't have technical skill, myself included, I'm no data scientist. I've only had the chance to work really closely with many of them. Look for the tools that let you use the benefits of AI without necessarily having to go and build them yourselves. Because as a starting point, it's so much faster. AI, we're still in the early days. It is very hard to build, and the opportunity is huge, but there are more and more tools that let each of us just use those capabilities without having to build something from scratch. Um, I'm going to wrap it up pretty quickly here, but these are some of the risks that I think it's really meaningful to think about. Bias and fairness. There are all sorts of examples of algorithmic bias, be it racism, sexism. When an AI is trained on a large amount of historical data, the biases that were present in our historical data become built into that AI. So if you have an AI system that is looking at housing costs, or looking at property prices in the United States, where you had severe racism and segregation, the costs based by neighborhood engender that same racism if an AI were to be used in predicting housing prices by neighborhood in the future. And this has been happening for quite some time in a series of tools across the US. Privacy, I think privacy is paramount in the work that we do at Autumn. The data is incredibly sensitive, how people feel, their mental health. And the only way that we are able to take a human in the loop approach, the only way we're able to involve people is by putting their privacy first. Safe use and security. I think this one is a no-brainer, just making sure that we think critically about how it's being used, and from the beginning, considering the negative outcomes. I think with my experience in Myanmar and what we've seen, across the board more recently, starting from a place of considering what is the worst possible outcome if we were to deploy this, software or AI, is a healthy and I think ultimately a necessary thing to do, instead of focusing, as many of us may, perpetual optimists, on what are all the possible benefits. And it's just a check on, where things could go. And then explainability. A lot of people use AI as kind of waving a magic wand or making miraculous predictions, but ultimately it's very difficult for many AI models to clearly articulate how they got to their predictions. And if we've ever, seen Wizard of Oz or talked with people who are maybe particularly adept at kind of obfuscating, the importance of understanding how we got to the conclusions we got to is critical, because that's how we root out bias. That's how we ensure privacy. That's how we ensure that the outcome is meaningful. As a final example on that front, there's a very famous prediction task where an AI was developed to identify whether an animal was a wolf or a dog. And even for humans, this might be somewhat difficult in some scenarios where it's difficult to say whether or not a husky dog is a wolf or a dog. But they developed, and there was an AI model developed that was able to look at wolves and dogs, and with 99.9% accuracy predict which animal was a wolf and which was a dog. The problem is, when they looked a little bit deeper, they realized that what the AI was actually predicting, the reason for its accuracy, was all of the pictures of the wolves that it was training were always standing on snow. And so they found that the only way that the AI was actually making its prediction was by looking at whether or not the animal was in a snowy background or not. And once they removed the background, the accuracy was absolutely terrible. And so this is just an example of kind of a harmless example of where, like, understanding what data is actually meaningful is incredibly powerful and important to understanding what the AI is actually doing. I have some more slides on Autumn specifically, but at a high level, this is the problem that we're solving. We see the kind of proliferation of mental health challenges as really, really critical, particularly when there are so few healthcare providers to address them, both in North America, but around the world. And our goal is to help people better measure their mental health, get resources proactively, and ultimately get support before they get to the point of actually needing, downstream healthcare support. using many of the lessons we learned from the work in Myanmar, from the work we did at Advent in Bangladesh. And today that's what we continue to work on. So I will pause there because I've been talking for some time, but yeah, hopefully this was helpful, and hopefully there were some things that were useful in thinking about where the opportunities are, I think where work still needs to be done, and maybe how you can use AI in the context of your own work.